On Sunday, April 2nd, 1972, at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the entire nation of Nigeria held its breath. For months, the government had been preparing for this exact moment. They had spent £3 million. They had deployed thousands of traffic wardens. They had even restricted the national speed limit to 20 miles per hour. At midnight, all traffic had been ordered to stop, a mandatory cooling-off period. And then, as the sun rose over Lagos, millions of drivers did something that felt entirely unnatural. They took their hands off the steering wheel, checked their mirrors, and slowly steered their vehicles across the white median line. They moved from the left side of the road to the right. It was a moment of profound national anxiety. The day before, minibus drivers had gathered to worship Ogun, the god of iron, praying for protection against the steel machines they were about to pilot into unknown territory. But why did they have to move at all? If you look at a map of the world today, you will see a strange, invisible border that cuts across continents. In 165 countries, people drive on the right, but in 74 countries, accounting for a quarter of all the roads on Earth, people still drive on the left. This isn't a random distribution, it is a fossil record, a map of ghosts. Because the side of the road you drive on today wasn't decided by modern traffic engineers or safety studies. It was decided by a law written in London in 1835. A law designed for horse-drawn carriages, which was then exported at the barrel of a gun to the furthest reaches of the globe. The past isn't dead, it's just hiding in your habits. The official story of why we drive on the side we do is usually framed as a matter of simple pragmatism. If you ask a traffic historian, they will tell you that driving on the right makes sense because most people are right-handed. In the late 18th century, teamsters in France and the United States began driving large wagons pulled by several pairs of horses. These wagons had no driver's seat. The driver sat on the left rear horse, keeping his right arm free to use his whip. Because he was sitting on the left, he wanted oncoming traffic to pass on his left, so he could look down and make sure the wheels didn't collide. Therefore, he kept his wagon to the right side of the road. It is a neat, logical explanation. But the historical record reveals a much darker, more coercive reality. The side of the road you drive on was rarely a choice. It was an imposition. Before the French Revolution, the aristocracy in France traveled on the left side of the road, forcing the peasantry over to the right. But in 1789, as the guillotine began to fall, the wealthy suddenly found it very dangerous to be seen acting like aristocrats. They abandoned the left side of the road and blended in with the peasants on the right. By 1794, keeping to the right had become an official law in Paris. And then came Napoleon Bonaparte. As Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, they didn't just bring the Napoleonic Code. They brought the right-hand traffic rule. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Germany, Poland, Spain, and Italy all were forced to drive on the right. But there was one empire Napoleon could not conquer, the British Empire. In Britain, the logic of the road was entirely different. For centuries, the convention in England had been to travel on the left. The reason was simple, and it had nothing to do with wagons. It had to do with swords. Since most people are right-handed, a swordsman traveling on a road wanted to keep his right arm closer to any potential opponent passing him. By traveling on the left, his sword arm was perfectly positioned to strike at anyone coming the other way. Furthermore, a right-handed person wears their scabbard on the left. It is nearly impossible to mount a horse from the right side while wearing a sword on the left. You must mount from the left, and if you mount from the left, it is safer to do so on the edge of the road rather than in the middle of traffic. Therefore, you ride on the left. This medieval martial logic was codified into law by the British Parliament. In 1835, the Highway Act made left-hand driving mandatory across Britain. And as the British Empire expanded, it took the Highway Act of 1835 with it. Administrators didn't consult local customs, they simply laid down the law of London. The infrastructure of the colonies, the roads, the railways, the ports, was designed for one purpose: the extraction of resources back to the mother country. And the rules governing that infrastructure were British rules. By the mid-20th century, the British Empire had collapsed. Nations across Africa and Asia had won their independence. But independence is a complicated thing. You can lower a flag and you can change a constitution, but you cannot easily dig up thousands of miles of roads or replace millions of vehicles. The newly independent nations found themselves trapped in a logistical nightmare. Take West Africa. Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia were all former British colonies, and they all drove on the left. But they were surrounded by former French colonies: Benin, Cameroon, Niger, Chad, Ivory Coast, Senegal, all of which drove on the right, a legacy of Napoleon. If a Nigerian truck driver wanted to transport goods from Lagos to Lomé in Togo, he had to cross a border and immediately switch to driving on the opposite side of the road. It was chaotic, dangerous, and terrible for trade. Furthermore, the global automobile market was shifting. The United States and mainland Europe were mass-producing cheap, reliable cars, all designed with the steering wheel on the left for driving on the right. Left-hand drive vehicles were becoming more expensive and harder to source. The ghost of the British Empire was strangling the economic future of West Africa. Which brings us back to that Sunday morning in Lagos in 1972. The decision by Nigeria's head of state, Major General Yakubu Gowon, and his Federal Commissioner for Works, Femi Okunu, to switch to the right was not just a matter of traffic management. It was an act of economic decolonization. It was a deliberate severing of the infrastructural umbilical cord that tied Nigeria to London, and a pivot toward regional integration with its African neighbors. The transition was brutal. On the Tuesday following the switch, Lagos experienced gridlock so severe that a 20-minute commute took 2 hours. The Federal Commissioner for Works himself, who normally drove to his office in 20 minutes, was on the road for more than 2 hours. But it worked. The accident rate actually plummeted in the first month, as terrified drivers crept along at a snail's pace. Death resulting from road accidents decreased by 77.6% in April 1972, compared with the corresponding month in 1971. 2 years later, on August 4, 1974, Ghana followed suit, becoming the last major West African nation to abandon the left side of the road. But the ghost of 1835 has not been entirely exorcised. Today, if you travel to Kenya, South Africa, India, Australia, or even Japan, which was never colonized by Britain but adopted British railway engineering in the 19th century, you will still find traffic flowing on the left. Here is what the record shows. It began with the martial paranoia of medieval swordsmen, codified into law by the British Parliament in the Highway Act of 1835. It stuck because infrastructure is the most stubborn form of memory. Once a nation builds its roads, its intersections, and its vehicle fleets around a specific rule, the cost of changing that rule becomes almost unimaginably high. Sweden managed it in 1967. Nigeria managed it in 1972. Ghana in 1974. But for many nations, the financial and logistical burden is simply too great. And so, every day, billions of people get into their cars, sit on the right side of the cabin, and steer their vehicles down the left side of the road. They are not thinking about the British Empire. They are not thinking about swordsmen or the Highway Act of 1835. They are just trying to get to work. But their hands are being guided by a law written nearly 200 years ago in a country thousands of miles away. Culture isn't an accident, and the past isn't dead. It's just hiding in your